Welcome, everybody. I'm Nareg Terzian, Head of Strategy and Communications at IOGP Europe, and I'm joined today by Alain Mathuren, Communications Director at FuelsEurope, the Refiners Association, but also by Amrit Naresh, who is Director of Energy Consulting at Wood Mackenzie and is based in London. The reason we're here today is to discuss the findings of a study that Concawe, the scientific arm of the Refiners Association, and IOGP Europe have commissioned together to Wood Mackenzie. And we hope to get into the details of this, but also to give the more general findings so that people understand what impact the regulation that entered into force in 2024 could potentially have as these new requirements, specifically on importers, enter into force as of the 1st of January 2027. So thank you both for being here, in particular to you, Amrit. And if that's okay, we'll jump straight into it.
Sounds good.
All right. We're going to first start by the methodology-related questions before we move on to the findings themselves. So a general question to kick it off. What is the purpose of the study?
Thanks very much, Nareg, and it's a pleasure to be here. The purpose of the study was to assess the potential market impacts of the EU Methane Regulation, in particular looking at the potential effects on the availability and affordability of natural gas and crude oil supplies for the EU.
Okay, very clear. So what choices have you made from a methodological standpoint? What has your team done to make this assessment?
Our starting point for the analysis is our base case, which is Wood Mackenzie's published view of the outlook of natural gas and crude oil and refined product markets. And so this is a business as usual outlook that assumes there's no implementation of the EU methane regulation. Against this base case, we evaluated two hypothetical scenarios. The first scenario is the default scenario, which assumes that the methane regulation is implemented as it was written, with no changes. The second scenario we call the adaptive scenario, and this assumes that there is greater flexibility in the implementation of the regulation, specifically in the granting of country-level equivalence for around 10 countries that export gas or crude to the EU.
As a follow-up, just to clarify for our audience, the reason you looked at these two is these are the two compliance pathways in the regulation. We haven't explored anything else because that is what is foreseen in the regulation. We haven't left out any other compliance pathway when working on the study, correct?
No, absolutely. So, in the EU methane regulation, equivalence can be met via two pathways. There is the country-level equivalence pathway. So if the non-EU producer country has rules for methane emissions reporting that are equivalent to the EU's rules, then all production of gas or crude oil within that country is considered compliant with the regulation. The other way that producers can meet equivalence is through the producer level pathway. And so this either is according to the Article 12 pathway, which represents producers that have monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements that are equivalent to the EU, or producers can meet producer level equivalence via the OGMP level 5 pathway, which means that the producer reports their methane emissions at the most rigorous level of the OGMP framework.
OGMP 2.0 being a voluntary reporting framework. And if I'm not mistaken, the regulation also asks that you combine that with third-party verification, which we can talk about more in detail. But so that's the second pathway, right? So producer level equivalency, reporting at OGMP 2.0 level 5 plus third-party verification.
Exactly.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for clarifying the points on methodology. Now, once you've said all of that, what does the study tell us? What are the main findings before we then go into it in more detail, and I pass it over to Alain.
The results of the analysis can be framed along these two scenarios, the default scenario and the adaptive scenario. So in the default scenario, which assumes that the regulation is implemented by the letter as it was written, we see the regulation risking the EU's security of supply, driving up energy costs and potentially eroding the competitiveness of Europe's industrial base. How does it do that? By placing severe limitations on the availability of compliant natural gas and crude oil that is available for the EU to import. So this effectively means that around 43% of the EU's natural gas imports in 2024 could effectively be excluded from the EU market by 2027. And around 87% of the EU's crude oil imports in 2024 could effectively be excluded from the EU market by 2027. And so this results in severe market dislocations on the natural gas side. The way we developed the results of the analysis was by assessing what share of production of natural gas and crude oil is likely to be compliant by 2027 all the way through 2035. And we applied constraints in our scenario models to say any compliant supply from an exporting country is allowed to flow to the EU. Any non-compliant supply is not allowed to flow to the EU. And so with that share of production globally being non-compliant, this results in our default scenario, record high gas prices and significant demand destruction in European natural gas markets, and a significant shift towards more affordable coal for power generation, which creates unintended consequences of higher emissions from the power sector. On the crude oil side, we see a severe reduction in the availability of compliant crude oil available to the EU refining system. So there isn't enough compliant crude available globally for the EU refiners to maintain their normal operating rates. And the crude oil that is available is effectively subject to all of the European refiners piling into that narrow slice of compliant crude oil that is available, which increases the price of that crude oil. And so the crude is available to the EU refiners at a much higher price, which causes a significant reduction in their competitiveness against other refining regions. So there's a chain reaction that then happens. Less competitive EU refiners are then forced to reduce their operating rates and their throughput. That effectively causes a supply shock in refined product markets, which causes gasoline and diesel prices to increase by 24% and 16% respectively. Those higher refined product prices are required to incentivize refiners in other parts of the world to increase their throughput so that they can export more product to the EU. So effectively, the in the crude oil and refined product market, the EU is reducing its own domestic refining of crude oil, and it's replacing the refined products that it would normally produce domestically with imported refined products at a much higher price.
Okay, quite the picture you're painting. Speaking of refining, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Alain to go through the rest of this in more detail.
Can I just add one point? That,
Sure.
There are, we evaluated two scenarios. So the impacts that I just described were for the default scenario. In the adaptive scenario, the results are a little bit different. So again, the adaptive scenario assumes that about 10 countries that are closest to achieving country level equivalence with the regulation are assumed to be equivalent to the EU regulation. That's a big assumption because currently no country is actually equivalent in terms of their policy being equal to the EU's methane policy.
The Commission hasn't yet said that any given country is compliant indeed, yeah?
Exactly. But if we assume that the 10 countries that are closest to achieving equivalence with the EU rules, so that includes places like Norway, the US, the UK, Canada, Qatar, then a lot more compliant supply is available to the EU. So instead of 43% of natural gas imports being excluded in the default scenario, it's only 20% of natural gas imports that are excluded in the adaptive scenario. I say only.
Yeah.
That's it's highly relative.
It's relative, yeah.
That's only relative to the default scenario.
It's equivalent to the closure of something like the Strait of Hormuz, for example. So something that people, unfortunately, these days are quite familiar with.
Exactly. So it's maybe an instructive situation that we're seeing right now.
So in the two scenarios, just to recap, the adaptive scenario, which is the better case scenario, has an impact that is still equivalent to, for example, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Directionally,
Okay.
that's not an unreasonable statement.
Yeah. And the default scenario, which is applying the regulations provisions as they are written now, that's a lot worse.
That's correct.
Okay.
And for the adaptive scenario, around 38% of the EU's crude oil imports would be excluded. That's lower than the 87% that would be excluded in the default scenario, but still excluding 38% of imports is still a significant volume. The market impacts in the adaptive scenario are also less severe than they would be in the default scenario, but still significant. So in the adaptive scenario, our models show TTF natural gas spot prices in Europe reaching around $19 per million BTU. So this is about twice as high as they would be in the absence of MER, based on comparison with our base case outlook. In terms of oil product markets, gasoline and diesel prices are around 1% higher than they would be in the absence of MER in the adaptive scenario. So significantly smaller impact than the default scenario, but still noticeable and probably more impactful for natural gas in the adaptive scenario.
And while the price impact on refined fuels is lower, the impact on refining throughput remains substantial even in the adaptive scenario, if I understand well.
That's right. In the adaptive scenario, there is still a significant impact on EU refinery throughput.
Okay.
Throughput drops by around 150,000 barrels per day relative to the base case. So this is the equivalent of the closure of kind of one additional medium-sized refinery in the EU. So, that's still a significant impact. It's nowhere near as big as the impact in the default scenario, where you see the equivalent of 40 refineries closing.
So when you refer to, for natural gas, when you mention 43% of supply based on 2024 being potentially excluded, just from a contractual standpoint, what does that look like? Because the reason I'm asking you is this. A couple of years ago, in discussions with policymakers after the 2022 crisis began, a lot of policymakers were telling us, but it's fine, we can just work with spot contracting in the future. Obviously now we're realizing that that is also exposure to market volatility. But your assessment, the 43%, what is that? What contracts does that take into account, and what does it not take into account? How do you get to that number if you look at contracts?
We assume that, as the regulation states, that that gas or crude that is under long-term supply contracts that were entered into before August 2024 are effectively assumed to be compliant with the regulation. And so we allow those volumes to continue flowing. Long-term contracts play much more of a role in natural gas markets than they do for crude oil. Oil contracts tend to be annual, evergreen, and renewed annually, whereas gas and LNG contracts are more commonly under long-term contract. And so, based on Wood Mackenzie's assessments, there are a little over 100 billion cubic meters of gas and LNG that are under long-term contract by 2027. And so those volumes are allowed to continue flowing in our models.
Okay.
And so that's why you end up with a lower share of natural gas being excluded from the EU market than crude oil, because more gas is under long-term contract.
If they weren't, they would have faced the same compliance problems as contracts that have to be signed after the date of entry of the regulation, which you mentioned was
Exactly.
August 2024. Okay, very clear. Thank you.
Sure.
Alain, you want to
Thank you.
take it away for the rest
Surely
of the
do.
findings?
Surely do. Thank you. We understand that the strict compliance of the MER is the default scenario. Although we don't hear alarm bells ringing inside the Commission or any of the institutions, there are other studies that seem to give different results, at least to say that there is no problem. How would you explain that, or what are the reasons of those differences?
Yeah, I think you need to consider the whole picture, right? That a relatively simplistic analysis of macro level supply and demand, supply of compliant product globally, and comparing that to EU demand is insufficient to really assess the true market impact of where is the compliant supply coming from, is the physical infrastructure in place to actually move that product to the EU, for example. So, our analysis considers kind of multiple levels of constraints that are needed for that compliant product to actually reach the EU market. So at the first level, we consider global production. That's simple. Then we also consider the infrastructure constraints. So, for example, the pipeline networks to actually bring natural gas into the EU, or the LNG liquefaction and regasification facilities to bring LNG to EU shores. Gas production in a place like China will never make it to the EU based on today's infrastructure constraints. And so a simple look at kind of macro level supply and demand is not sufficient. We also consider the achievement of OGMP level 5 reporting as a share of production in every major exporting country. Then we also consider the verification of that OGMP level 5 supply and the certification of those molecules via systems like constrained book and claim. And then I think crucially, this is one kind of key differentiator for our study, is that the market impacts are then modeled through our scenario models, the global gas model on the gas side and the refinery supply model on the crude oil side. to assess the actual supply-demand dynamics, considering available infrastructure, competing sources of demand, so that the price impacts are not only driven by what's the marginal cost of supply of the next available compliant molecule, but also, what is the impact of competing demand from other consumers in other regions, like Asia, for example, and what impact does that have on prices?
Okay, thank you. Just 2 points of clarification. Firstly, you mentioned OGMP. OGMP stands for Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. If I'm not mistaken, this is a voluntary program where individual organizations demonstrate that they are having I would say, sustainable pathway for their production and throughout the value chain, right?
That's correct.
Okay, good. So that's for the clarity of our
Absolutely.
viewers. Back to these differences, is it a lack of verification, of certification that is also part of these differences? Is it possible, or is it are these assessed in the same way in all those studies that we have for now?
Other studies that we've seen published don't seem to account for the certification of the compliant molecules. So that's a key part of our scenario definitions, that companies that achieve OGMP level 5, that production needs to be certified in order to meet the requirements of the regulation. And so not all of that is automatic, right? That, constrained book and claim systems and solutions take time to put in place. And so that's a potential near-term constraint on the availability of compliant supply. I should also just add, in terms of where we're not so different from other assessments and studies that have been released, if you look at our estimates of what share of production from major gas and oil exporting countries achieves OGMP level 5, it's not so different from the assessment that I believe OGMP itself recently published. So, for some countries, we're a little bit higher. For some countries, we're a little bit lower. But on an aggregate basis, we end up with quite a similar view of what share of global production is at OGMP level 5. But I think the certification aspect and the availability of the infrastructure to physically get those molecules to the European market are where we think other studies may not have done ample consideration.
Okay, so just before we change to another topic, we have the equivalence, and for now, no single producer is equivalent to the EUMR. And we have the OGMP level 5, where we currently have a very limited, what's the percentage of companies or suppliers that are meeting the requirements of OGMP level 5?
So based on the latest 2025 company fact sheet released by OGMP, it's around, based on our estimates and our kind of bottom-up modeling, based on kind of field level data tied to individual producers, and then tying that to each producer's achievement of different levels of OGMP reporting, we estimate around 6% of global gas production was at OGMP level 5, and 7% of global crude oil production was at OGMP
That's
level
25.
5.
Do you see any significant progress occurring by 2027?
We see gradual progress, but nowhere near enough to meet the EU's demand requirements.
Okay, so
One clarification question, if I may. So what you're telling us is, I'm just going to take the gas numbers, which I'm more familiar with. If you just take gas numbers, the EU's gas demand on an annual basis was around 330 BCM. If you had double that amount reported, hypothetically, under OGMP level 5, is that enough to say, well, then you don't have to worry about it? Or if I understood well, there are additional constraints that need to be taken into account, which then lead to the supply issue that we have. Can you just clarify that to make sure?
That's correct. So if there is, I think we would agree with that assessment that by 2027, there's twice as much global production at OGMP level 5 than there is EU demand for
Right.
gas. But that's before accounting for the certification of those molecules.
Okay.
So once you apply assumptions around the implementation of traceability solutions such as constrained book and claim, so once you consider the certification requirements for those molecules, then that reduces the volume of supply to below what the EU actually
Okay.
requires for its demand.
Has to go.
Thank you. You just mentioned the word traceability. What have you considered as traceability system?
So traceability requires importers to be able to identify upstream producers to certify that the molecules that they are importing are meeting the requirements of OGMP level 5 or any other requirement. So there are a few different systems for doing this. They're all quite nascent. Book and claim is the least challenging system to implement. It only requires a digital registry and contractual agreements, but it faces some integrity challenges because it decouples the physical product from the claim. The next level up is constrained book and claim. This requires investment in platforms and registries and audit processes to allow a certification of verified production and transport of gas or crude. This is still difficult to implement, but we think it's achievable in the medium term. And so our assumptions use the constrained book and claim as the assumption for traceability. The kind of highest integrity and most difficult system of doing traceability is through full trace and claim, which is almost an impossible prospect for commingled commodities like LNG or crude oil, because this would require, unprecedented, costly segregation of molecules, which is not a feasible prospect.
What is the European legislation asking for?
It doesn't define it very clearly.
Okay.
What system is
So
actually
we have
required.
here we have here some kind of open questions. As of 2027, we need to be compliant. How long will it take to recover a supply that would meet what we are requiring in terms of oil and gas,
Mhm.
and also in terms of control of the energy cost? Let me say.
It really depends which scenario. That answer kind of differs in the default scenario versus the adaptive scenario. So in the default scenario, which assumes that the regulation is implemented as is, a delay of 3 or 4 years actually would not even be sufficient to avoid severe market impacts for the natural gas market, because there isn't enough supply to meet demand in our outlook in that default implementation scenario. For crude oil, a delay of 3 to 4 years would enable the market to avoid the worst outcomes. We would still see significant outcomes, but not quite as bad as it is in the first few years of the regulation. And that's because we model progress on meeting producer level equivalence in the implementation of traceability solutions that enables more compliant product to reach the EU market after 2030.
Okay.
And in the adaptive scenario, I'll simplify by saying that a delay of 3 to 4 years would avoid the worst outcomes for both gas and crude. So similarly, you would have still some significant market impacts, but not the worst impacts which occur in the 2027 to 2029 period.
Okay, so summary, we need a couple of years to pause it, find the right ways to develop an adaptive scenario, and from there we can reduce significantly the impact.
Correct.
The last point is important. This is why both of our organizations are calling for the so-called stop the clock. The deadline is really close. It's less than a year. I think the study is showing that the impact would be relatively severe. I like the fact that the adaptive scenario shows us a better way. Although it's still not ideal, I think it by proving that if you make certain changes in the regulation itself, as you said, you can actually solve, depends at which level, but you can solve the problem, basically. Perhaps not the adaptive scenario isn't enough, but it depends who you give equivalency to, what requirements you put on producers, etc. So I think I want to take away something positive as well from the work you've done, that there isn't just a catastrophic default scenario where, Europe faces a supply issue that's comparable to the 2022 post invasion of Ukraine energy crisis. It has also the possibility to make changes to the regulation and avoid that altogether. So that's kind of the way I'm choosing to look at it. Some people will probably tell us we're being very alarmist, but I think it's the first time anybody has done this assessment. I think at IOGP Europe, we wish it was done earlier by the Commission itself, and that those who did it after the regulation came entered into force had done it at this level of detail. So I really appreciate the work that was done, and hope we won't see that materialize in real life.
Just as a conclusion, because I think people understand when it is something that they will have in their day-to-day life. And one element they understand pretty easily is the cost of a liter of gasoline or the cost of a liter of diesel. What would that mean in practice? If you were to apply the default scenario today, what does that mean for consumers? What does that mean for businesses?
In short, the default scenario sees a dramatic increase in the price of gasoline and diesel. We see a 24% increase in the price of gasoline relative to our base case, and a 16% increase in the price of diesel relative to our base case. And the mechanism by which this happens is effectively there isn't enough crude oil for the EU refiners to maintain their normal levels of crude oil throughput. The crude oil that is available to them is much more expensive. So they become much less competitive versus other refiners in the world. So the EU refining system reduces its throughput by about 50%. That reduces the supply of gasoline and diesel and other refined products on the market. So it's effectively a supply shock. So when supply falls, prices need to rise to incentivize more supply of gasoline and diesel and other refined products from other refiners in other parts of the world. Those higher prices are required to incentivize higher production from those other refiners, who then, in our models, export more gasoline, diesel, and other refined products to the EU. So effectively, you see EU consumers of gasoline and diesel paying significantly higher prices for that fuel, and they're paying it to refiners in other parts of the world, in Asia, the Middle East, the US Gulf Coast, rather than to the European domestic refiners.
So in other words, Europe loses it everywhere. But 25% for gasoline means up to 50 cents.
Never mind the strategic assets that could be lost in the process. Thanks very much, Amrit, for your time. I think the findings are interesting enough to get people's attention on this topic. I mean, I have to say that so far, both of our organizations present here, FuelsEurope and IOGP Europe, have been advocating for people to actually try and fix this. Policymakers try and fix this. For a while now, we have a decent coalition of organizations across the oil and gas value chain, but also now energy intensives that are realizing that this could be problematic in the short term. So you're giving us numbers to consider in all of this debate. So I want to thank you again for the work done over the past few months. It's been a pleasure working with you guys, and honestly to learn because you've taught us a lot. You've had a lot of meat to the bones, if I can put it that way. So thanks very much for
My
that.
pleasure.
And for us, we need to sit together with institutions. We need to find ways to fix it because there's no point not to have a regulation. This is, to be clear also, we want this regulation to work without any unintended consequences for European industry, European consumers, and Europe as a whole. So yes, we have a long journey ahead of us to make the required adjustment to the regulation.
Thanks again,
Thank you.
both of you. Thank you to our listeners. You can listen to this on Spotify or watch it on our YouTube channel, as well as those of Fuels Europe. We'll be communicating those in due course as soon as the episode is available. Thanks again.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you. Bye-bye.